Hey everyone, this is Matthew Jana for Card Runners, and I'm here with Cutoff versus Button versus Blind Play Part 1. This is a new series that's going to be several videos, and in this series I'll be examining how to play both as the cutoff and against the cutoff in many different situations. We'll tackle everything, pre-flop, flop, turn, and river play, but I do plan to put extra emphasis on 3-bet pots. That's because I think 3-bet pots are the name of the game right now. Basically, people just really think you should be 3-betting very aggressively now against cutoff and especially button opens, and also people defend much more aggressively by calling against 3-bets. So it's really important to get comfortable in 3-bet pots, so that's what I want to put a lot of emphasis on for this series. And I will also try to make my best guess and then analyze it more than I used to. So what I mean by this is I usually have a very methodical approach when I'm looking at like a flop texture or a turn texture. I'll often first ask myself, what hands do I want to raise for value, then see how many value raises I have, and then from there figure out how many bluff raises I think I should have. So if you've seen my other videos, you'll probably see me say something like, okay, I'm raising 6 hands for value on the flop. I want to have 10 or 11 bluffs to balance out that range. And I think that's a very useful thing to do, but I also in this video want to sort of answer what I would do with specific hands very, very quickly, the way I'd have to actually do if I were actually playing. Because if you're actually playing, you don't have 10 or 15 minutes to sort of write down what you want to do with every single hand in your range. So I'm going to try to emphasize that a little bit more here. I'm going to try to give myself the chance to be wrong. And then when I am analyzing situations, if I'm randomly generating a flop or a turn, I want to give you an initial immediate guess for what I think the best line is and then analyze it later. In other words, I think you learn a lot more from giving yourself the chance to be wrong than you otherwise would. So a good example of this is if you're studying chemistry and you have to read a chapter on kinetics, you can easily be reading through the chapter, you're in school, you're reading through the chapter, you're understanding stuff, you feel like you get it. And then when you actually have to do problems and you do something wrong, that's when you really start learning it. Because if someone's just showing you how stuff works or showing you the right answer, you don't remember it nearly as well as if you actually tried to solve a problem or actually had to answer a question and then you did it wrong and someone explains to you why you were wrong. So I think the same thing applies in poker. If you actually allow yourself to be wrong and then you correct it, you're going to remember it a lot better than if someone's just like presenting you ranges for what they think is correct in a certain spot. So I'll probably be wrong lots of times in this series as I make my first initial guess, and hopefully that will let me and you guys remember my mistakes better. Goals for this video are first to make pre-flop ranges. Second is to get somewhat comfortable with different pre-flop situations. And third will be to examine how likely we'll be playing in 3-bet pots relative to single raise pots. So I really want to answer this question because I really want to emphasize 3-bet pots in this series, and I want to see if that looks like it's going to make sense. Pre-flop. One of my biggest past mistakes has been trying to use theory to create pre-flop ranges from scratch. This usually works out pretty terribly since you can't really model pre-flop play. And when I say it works out pretty terribly, I mean if you were to use just theory to make pre-flop ranges now, you'd make ranges a lot worse than the good players are currently using. Obviously, if you look at ranges now compared to 6 years ago, they look completely different, but using theory alone to make pre-flop ranges now does not work out very well. Most notably, the terms value bet and bluff don't work, and those are terms that people are used to using on every street, including pre-flop, when in reality, the terms work best on the river. They still work pretty well on the turn and on the flop, but they do not work well at all pre-flop, and even the flop can be really tricky. Okay, what you can do is use theory to check to see if ranges look clearly wrong, as well as sort of see if they look reasonable once you have a better sense of what you're looking for. And that's what we're going to do today. A bit more on pre-flop play. Luckily, I've done a lot of work on pre-flop ranges recently and should be able to make some pretty good ranges. I'll start with my best guess, and then we'll examine them. Be prepared to 3-bet and call 3-bets a lot. The math seems to justify this, as we'll see in a little bit. And high stakes, heads up, no limit players both 3-bet and call 3-bets a ton. And it is sort of good to understand what high stakes heads up players are doing because they are probably the best players in the world and you can learn a lot from them. Anyways, heads up players both 3-bet a lot now and they call 3-bets a ton. Granted, we're not going to analyze heads-up play, so while ranges will be stronger for the positions we're talking about, the cutoff basically opens a much tighter range than the button does in heads-up, the general principles are still going to apply. All right, so let's jump in. So take a few minutes to look at these ranges and we'll have a quick chat about them. Note how weak the big blind flatting range is. This means if the cutoff opens and the big blind calls, the cutoff is in pretty good shape. And it should make sense for the big blind to call with a pretty weak range because the big blind was closing the action pre-flop and got a really good price. So the cutoff is calling with many hands, just trying to lose less than one big blind overall for the hand. So if the cutoff folds pre-flop, it loses one big blind. If he calls, he might still overall lose money on average with his hand, but he's losing less than he would by folding. So it's a plus EV call. We'll assume a 2.5 big blind opened and a 8.25 big blind 3-bet in position and a 9.25 big blind 3-bet out of position. Okay, so as we look at these ranges, keep in mind that this is my first best guess, given the fact that we're assuming the cutoff opens to 2.5 big blinds. I have done this pre-flop stuff a lot, but as the opening size changes, or if we assume there's antes, the math's always going to be a little bit different. So this is just my best guess given a 2.5 cutoff open. All right, so for the cutoff opening range, I'm opening 26.7%. That's what I would about open with if I was playing. And I'm using a mixture of high equity hands and hands that have less equity but more robust equity. So most people watching this probably know what that means, but if you don't, it just means a hand like 5-4 suited, we're opening with it despite it having such little equity because its equity is so robust. A 5-4 suited can make 4 different straight combinations, and by 4 different straight combinations, I mean we have a straight on an ace-2-3 board, a 2-3-6 board, a 3-6-7 board, and a 6-7-8 board. So it makes 4 straight combinations, which is the max. And it has the flush draw. So it has very robust equity because it can make some awesome hands. Whereas King 10 off over here has way more equity, but its equity is a lot more meh. It can't make any really useful flushes. And it only makes 2 straight combos. It only makes the ace, jack, queen straight and the queen, jack, 9 straight. So there's no way to know what hand's best preflop because you can't convert equity into expected value because not all equity is the same. Anyways, this is what I chose to open with. I could easily see an argument for like King 4 suited being better than 6-4 suited. I do think King 4 suited is better than 6-4 suited in like the button, but in the cutoff, I don't know. I kind of like the robust equity a little bit more. There's no way to know for sure. At the end of the day, this is the range that I would open with. If you use a slightly different opening range, I really don't think it matters. Note, one way we're really going to check to see if this cutoff opening range looks reasonable is by how aggressively it needs to defend against 3-bets. So here, since we open about 27%, we're probably going to have to call 3-bets, with about 12 or 11% of all possible hands, and that's not counting the times we 4-bet. So we're going to have to, defend some hands here that are probably quite a bit weaker than some people are used to, but we'll go into detail about that pretty soon. So here's what I have for the cutoff versus 3-bet flat. So I guess pretty soon meant the very next range. So if we get 3-bet, and it would change slightly based on if the button or the small blind or if the big blind 3-bet us. Again, we'll talk about this more in a minute. But if the cutoff, if we do get 3-bet after opening the cutoff, this is mostly the range I'm looking to call with. I'm calling with my good suited aces, a lot of these high suited cards. King Jack off and Ace 10 off, you see that green bar underneath them? That means I think it's mixed, meaning I think you probably call Ace 10 off sometimes, fold it sometimes, call King Jack off sometimes, fold it sometimes. Or if you don't want to fold it, you can also 4-bet it. I don't really want to get into a discussion of whether you need to 4-bet like the suited aces or these. Both are fine. So this is what I would probably call with. Again, this is probably a lot wider than a lot of people are used to. And if you are playing against opponents that aren't 3-betting super aggressively, you probably don't need to defend nearly this aggressively. But Optimal Poker probably plays a very, very aggressive 3-betting game pre-flop. So you're going to need to defend with hands like this because remember, a lot of these hands we're calling with pre-flop, we're getting like 2-to-1 odds and we're usually going to have position. So we're getting a really good price and we have a positional advantage. So that's why we're calling with stuff like 8-7 suited or pocket 7s or queen 9 suited. It's not because we're happy to be in the situation we're in. We just think we're getting a good price. We can probably win a little bit more money by calling than we'll lose by folding. I think that last sentence kind of sucked. So let me clarify what I mean. If we fold to a 3-bet preflop, we lose 2.5 big blinds overall for the hand. If we call a 3-bet, a lot of these hands are probably still going to overall lose money. They're just going to lose less than 2.5 big blinds. So for example, let's say we call a 3-bet with queen 9 suited. Maybe we only lose, 2.1 big blinds on average, whereas if we fold, we always lose 2.5 big blinds. So that's why I'm calling with a lot of these hands. It's because I think I just lose a little bit less by calling than by folding. It's not because I'm happy to be calling with these hands. Then also note, if I am calling, like let's just imagine we either call or fold king jack off, then that means by definition the EV has to be 0 because folding has 0 EV. If we think it's a mixed strat where we call sometimes and fold sometimes, then the EV has to be 0 for both. And I also just lastly don't have a very strong opinion about a lot of these things. Some people watching this might be like, oh my gosh, ace 10 off is way better than 10-8 suited. Or some people might think the opposite. They might think pocket sixes or 6-5 suited are better than king jack off. Cool. I mean, no one really knows. I would use, as I said, this is the range that I would use, but I don't have a strong opinion. The last thing to note, and this is probably going to confuse a lot of people, so don't spend too much time worried about this if you don't immediately understand it. But just note that if we don't 4-bet a completely polarized range, or another way to say that is when we're 4-betting, we don't need to only 4-bet our good hands and our hands that are too weak to call. It might be less polarized than that. So maybe a hand like ace 7 suited is actually a slightly profitable call, or ace 4 suited is a slightly profitable call when facing a 3-bet, but they actually are even slightly more profitable to 4-bet. I think that actually might be the case, which is why, when a lot of these hands are debatable, like ace 7, ace 6 suited, king jack off, ace 10 off, maybe even something like pocket sixes, I decided to 4-bet the ace x suited. So again, if that confused you, don't worry about it. If you're already a pretty advanced player and think a lot about theory, maybe that caused a few things to click, and maybe you agree with me, which is why we might 4-bet some of these hands, like we might 4-bet ace 7 suited and call 10-8 suited, even though honestly, I think ace 7 suited is probably better than 10-8 suited. And just to say it one more time, and I am going to talk about it later, we will adjust this range a little bit based on if the 3-bet comes from the button, small blind, or big blind, but against pretty much all those ranges, I think it would look pretty similar to this. All right, so let's move on to the cutoff 4-bet versus 3-bet. All right, so there you see the suited aces and then all the stuff that was obviously going to be 4-bet, like kings, queens, jacks, and ace kings, since those were missing from our calling range. So it's possible like ace king might be somewhat of a mixed strategy when we face a 4-bet from the blinds, but if the blinds are 3-betting hands like ace queen, then I think 4-betting something like ace king becomes more profitable than flatting. So this would be my, pretty much general, what I think is close to theoretically correct default 4-betting range when facing a 3-bet. If you want to get really anal, there might be too many aces in this range because we're sort of like 4-bet bluffing all our ace x suited. And while that might be true if we get super technical, I think it's more important to just put the good 4-bet bluffs in the range. And then if, no one's going to exploit you for 4-betting this rather than this. But yeah, technically speaking, there might be too many suited aces. Okay, so let's look at the button flat. All right. So notice how ace queen also has the bar underneath it. That means I think it's sort of a mixed strat. So yeah, here's the button call versus a cutoff open. So what's kind of interesting to note about this is I think it's fine, especially in practice, to cold call some monsters in the button against the cutoff open. And again, if you've seen a lot of my old videos, I'm very big on like slow playing pocket aces against a 3-bet in a lot of situations. But whereas I used to like cold calling with some aces and ace king off and the button against the cutoff open, now I more have had the attitude which is like, let's just 3-bet all those hands. And then if we do get squeezed, we can still defend with a lot of hands in these range against the squeeze. And if our range happens to be capped at, like, let's say, ace-queen suited when we face a squeeze, or pocket nines when we face a squeeze, or maybe if you wanted to call with pocket tens when we face a squeeze, I don't think that's really that problematic. So this range can still defend against a squeeze without having hands like pocket aces or ace-king off. And more or less, this is just a range designed to hopefully play pretty well in position, either multi-way or when we're heads up on the flop. So whenever we call in the button against the cutoff open with this range, we're really never going to want to get squeezed, but that doesn't mean we're always going to fold. We'll still think calling with a hand like king-queen suited is more profitable than folding when we face a squeeze. And always keep it in mind, when the blinds do squeeze, they have to worry about both the cutoff and us, and the cutoff could have all of his premium hands in his range, whereas we'll always be in position, and we can still call with a range of, I'm just going to click buttons real quick, I didn't work this range out, but you can still call with some range that might be something like this that still does, fairly decently well against the opponent's squeeze. I once again think that last sentence kind of sucked. So let me try to clarify again exactly what I meant, because this is actually being harder to explain than I thought. So we always have to take the most plus EV line on every single street. And since now I think the cutoff defends so much more aggressively against 3-bets than people used to think, I think 3-betting tens and better and ace-king, and sometimes even ace-queen, is more profitable than calling with them. So because of that, our calling range is capped pre-flop. But just because our calling range is capped doesn't mean we're always going to fold to a squeeze. We'll still think calling with some hands when facing a squeeze is more profitable than folding. That said, we definitely don't want to face a squeeze with this range, but that's still not going to allow our opponents to squeeze super recklessly, because when the blind squeeze, we still are going to call reasonably often, and then they also have to worry about defending against the cutoff. And, the cutoff can still have all of his premium hands. So yeah, when we call a squeeze here, we're really never going to be that happy. Our range isn't going to be that great, but we still do have, enough hands that can profitably call against a squeeze to prevent our opponent from, getting crazy, reckless, squeeze happy in the blinds. Okay. All right, so let's look at the button flat range, the button 3-bet range right now. Okay, so 10%, pretty aggro in the 3-bet department. We're 3-betting tens and better and ace-queen. I'm not super passionate about whether or not to 3-bet or flat ace-queen or tens, but I think I do overall prefer 3-betting them. And then I'm 3-betting a lot of, I'm really emphasize 3-betting high equity hands here. So 3-betting ace-x suited and king-x suited, which not only have a reasonable amount of equity, but they also have some really robust equity in the form of the flush draw. And then hands like ace-10 off, king-jack off, queen-jack off, they're not really that robust, right? They can't really make super strong hands. They can't make flushes. Queen-jack off can still make a reasonable number of straights, but for the most part, ace-10 off, king-jack off, and queen-jack off do not have robust equity. But they can give us a lot of good pair medium kicker stuff, which is really nice for our range, especially when we're in position. We're often almost always really going to have the option of checking back the flop, so we can sort of take a street out of the game. So in other words, I think hands like top pair medium or top pair weak kicker become significantly easier to play when we're in position. So that's also why I like having these hands in the 3-betting range more when we're in position. If we're out of position, I like having the suited connectors a little bit more, because we're often going to have to sort of barrel aggressively when we're out of position, and those hands make good semi-bluffs. So to be clear about what I just said, I'm not saying even out of position I would rather have these suited connectors than these hands right here, because ace-10 off, king-jack off, and queen-jack off have just so much equity. I might still. I'm just saying I'm not saying that for sure, and it might depend on positions. I am just saying I think hands like king-jack off are better and easier to play when in a position than out of position, because it's so easy to put in a check somewhere. Whereas when we're out of position, we can't really make sure that check goes through. All right, so yeah, this should be, I think this should be pretty easy. I think most people should be comfortable in a range like that. All right, so let's look at the small blind 3-bet. Ayo! So this one's fun. So I do not like cold calling in the small blind against an open from any position. And the reason for that is when you call in the small blind, we don't have that much dead money invested pre-flop to begin with, so you're not getting that big of a discount on your call. You're guaranteed to be out of position. You might be out of position multi-way, and it's really hard to defend against squeezes, because it's really hard to justify slow playing anything in the small blind. So then when your opponent squeezes, he knows you're capped, and you're out of position against the big blind. So yeah, I think calling in the small blind just really isn't effective at all. Like most people, I used to do it because I didn't really understand how you can 3-bet without it being a value 3-bet or a bluff 3-bet preflop. So if you were like me, you'd end up calling with stuff like king, queen off or ace-jack off, because you were like, well, wait a second, why 3-bet it? It's not value or it's not a bluff. But once you sort of start to understand things at a deeper level and move away from that, I think it's just more profitable to 3-bet ace-jack off and king, queen off than it is to call, even though, it's true that it's not a value 3-bet or a bluff. All right, so I 3-bet 15% or around there, and these are basically just the hands that I think are the most profitable. So every hand I'm folding I think is worse than every hand in the 3-betting range. Again, I don't know the answer to this stuff. I don't know if 6-5 suited is better than queen-jack off. I could easily see something like ace-7 or ace-6 suited being better than 6-5 suited. I almost feel like that right now. I didn't feel like that when I made this range, I guess, so we're going to roll with it. But yeah, I'm not sure if 6-5 suited or ace-6 suited is better. there's just no way to know. 6-5 suited is definitely easier to play. So being the mere muggle that I am, I probably would prefer to 3-bet that rather than ace-6 suited, but I'm not sure if in theory that's correct. I have no idea. Ace-6 suited just has a lot more equity. So yeah, this is the range that I'm using. It's a very aggro small blind 3-betting range, so just be aware, spoiler alert, you have to be comfortable playing 4-bet pots out of position to really make this range work. But that's not as hard as it sounds. So in other words, like let's just say you 3-bet king queen suited and get 4-bet. You're probably going to have to call. But it's not that hard to play king queen suited. Obviously, your opponent's 4-betting range will be very polarized, which makes things tricky. But if we call king queen suited rather than fold against a 4-bet, we're really just saying we think we overall lose less money by calling the 4-bet than we do by folding. You know, we're still not happy to be in the situation we're in. And, you know, there's not going to be that much stacked up. It's pretty easy to tell if you flopped a king or a queen. So don't feel bad about having to call 4-bets with stuff like ace queen or king queen or, you know, even pocket tens or something like that. You just need to get comfortable with it. And we're going to talk about it more in this series if you're not comfortable right now. So anyways, there is the small blind 3-betting range. So one last thing I want to mention before moving on is a lot of people would probably call this small blind 3-betting range a linear 3-betting range. And I don't want to misquote him, but I also want to give credit where credit's due. The first person I ever heard talk about this was Ben Sauce123 Solsky, who's an insanely good high-stakes nosebleed player. And what a linear 3-betting range is it just means or at least the way I understand it, is we're 3-betting all of our good hands here, and then we're folding everything we don't think is strong enough to 3-bet. So, and we can do that because we have no calling range here. This may actually be easiest to explain by example. So let's look at how the button played against the cutoff. The button would 3-bet for value, and again, the term for value doesn't work perfectly, but close enough. It would 3-bet kings, jacks, queens, kings, aces, and then ace, king, and ace, queen for value. So right here, we're 3-betting ace, king, and ace, queen for value. We're calling with ace jack, ace 10, ace 9, ace 8 suited, and then we're sort of 3-bet bluffing ace 7, ace 6, ace 5, ace 4, ace 3, ace 2. Likewise, on the offsuit side of the Flopzilla, we're 3-betting ace king off for value. We're 3-betting ace queen off sometimes for value. We're calling with king queen and ace jack off, and then we're 3-bet bluffing, again, term doesn't work perfectly, with king jack off, queen jack off, and ace 10 off. So it's a bit of an oversimplification, but it's still somewhat similar to the idea where you 3-bet your best hands for value, call with your next best hand, and 3-bet bluff your hands not quite strong enough to call. And if we look at the calling range here, yeah, we'll notice like the medium strength stuff is in the calling range. But here, since the small blind range has no cold calling range pre-flop, it's just 3-betting the good stuff, has no calling range, and folding all the other stuff. I don't want to get too weird with it, but note you could also probably call an opening range a linear range, because an opening range functions the same way. You just open all of your good stuff, you don't really limp anything, so then you fold all the other stuff. So an opening range could also be linear because it only includes the best hands, it's not polarized. Here, the small blind 3-betting range, again, it only includes our best hands, it's not polarized. Now that we understand that, it hopefully will make it a little bit easier to understand the big blind 3-betting range. So, because we have the opportunity to call in the big blind and we close the preflop action while getting a better price on our call, the big blind 3-betting range is much more polarized than the small blind 3-betting range, which isn't polarized at all. And the big blind, I'm calling with all these medium strength hands, and then I chose to 3-bet these suited connectors and suited gappers, hands that have very robust equity, as well as 3-bet some suited aces and some suited kings, because these hands, if we 3-bet king 2 or king 3 or ace 2 suited, every time we make our hand fold a king when we have king 2 suited, or we make them fold an ace when we have ace 2 suited, we made them fold a hand that dominates us. The stuff in the upper left-hand corner is just what a lot of people call the value 3-bets, but even then, calling ace jack or king queen a value 3-bet really isn't using the term that well. So this is a range that I would call neither polarized nor linear. That said, it's obviously more polarized than the small blind 3-betting range. Now, there's no way to know what's best here, which is why I want to explain my logic for this range, because it's completely non-solvable and can totally be wrong. But understand that I'm 3-betting these suited aces, suited kings, and these suited gappers. The suited connectors and suited gappers, I think, retain their equity very well. They have very robust equity, which is why I like 3-betting them. And then the ace 2, ace 3, ace 4, king 3, king 2. These hands also have some very robust equity in the form of the flush draw, but when our opponent does fold a better ace or a better king, we made them fold a hand that dominates us. And it's also, I think, kind of good to 3-bet some of these ace-X and king-X suited hands because they'll give us hands that make reasonable check calls on ace and king high boards. But we might not need them because even if the flop was ace high, we still have, pocket kings, pocket queens, pocket jacks. If the board was king high, we still have pocket queens, pocket jacks. So there's really no way to know what's optimal here. This is just my best guess at the time of making this range. It's possible that it's better to call with these suited kings or suited aces rather than 3-bet them. And this lastly brings us to the big blind flat. So we're calling with a lot of hands where we just think calling is more profitable than folding. We'll still overall expect to lose money on the hand when we call with something like queen 9 off. We're just hoping to lose less than 1 big blind. And remember, we're getting a really good price. There's already going to be our opponent's cutoff open small blind. There's already going to be 4 big blinds in the pot, and then we're only having to put 1.5 big blinds more in to see the flop. And even a hand like 10-9 off or Jack-9 off can flop a really good hand. So no way to know what's correct here. Maybe I'm calling too wide. Maybe I'm calling too tight. This is the stuff that's absolutely the hardest to know what's correct, but this is probably about the range I would use. If the cutoff was opening bigger, like let's say the cutoff was opening to 3 or 3.5 big blinds. If that was the case, I don't think I would 3-bet all that differently. My 3-bet range I don't think would change that much if the cutoff was opening bigger. Because now, especially when I 3-bet and my opponent folds, I have 1 more money, and this range is still going to be very strong when our opponent calls a 3-bet. But I'm getting a lot worse price on my call when I have like something like 10-9 off or Jack-9 off. So as the cutoff were to open a bigger sizing, the way I would adjust would not be by changing my 3-betting range. I would still 3-bet about as aggressively. The way I would adjust is I would tighten up my calling range because I'm getting a much worse price on my call. It's a lot worse to have to put 2.5 big blinds in the pot to see a flop with queen 9 off than it is to put 1.5 big blinds. So just keep that in mind. It's something I haven't talked a lot about in other videos, but I think it's important to realize 3-betting ranges, I think, stay relatively consistent as the opening size gets bigger, whereas cold calling ranges will change a lot. And again, the 3-betting range will change too. I just mean I think you'll see the calling range change drastically, whereas the 3-betting range won't change as much as I think a lot of people would maybe assume. Okay, so that is all the ranges for our cutoff series. That's a lot of ranges. So now that we've just looked over all the ranges in detail, we're ready to move on to step 1, figuring out how much the cutoff pays to see a flop. This is probably the most important part of analyzing pre-flop play. Let's see if the cutoff is getting 3-bet too much, too little, or just right. So let's first start by figuring out what percentage of the time the cutoff does not get 3-bet. So it sounds like this is a really easy mistake to make, or is to just add up all the 3-bet percentages and assume that's how often the cutoff gets 3-bet. It doesn't work that way because then you can double count the times for both the button and the big blind with 3-bet if given the opportunity. So in order to start figuring out how often the cutoff gets 3-bet, we have to first figure out how often the cutoff is not 3-bet. You'll see in just a second. So figure out how often each position does not 3-bet the cutoff and then multiply the frequencies together. So the button 3-bets 10.1%, the small blind 3-bets 14.8%, and the big blind 10.7%. So then we take the frequency of the time the button does not 3-bet, the frequency of the time the small blind does not 3-bet, and the frequency of the time the big blind does not 3-bet, and multiply them together, and we see that the cutoff does not get 3-bet 68.4% of the time. So then if the cutoff does not get 3-bet 68.4% of the time, the cutoff does get 3-bet 1 minus 0.684 or 31.6% of the time. So I stop recording about every 90 seconds. That makes it easier to edit the video at the end. And then if I say something really wrong, I can pull a clip out. And I actually just stopped recording and I can tell that my voice is sounding nerdier as we go on and as I start talking numbers. So I want to make sure nothing's confusing. All we're trying to do is figure out how often the cutoff opens and gets 3-bet. And the way we do that is by first figuring out how often the cutoff is not 3-bet, and then we subtract that from 1. So that's all we've done here, and we found that the cutoff will open and get 3-bet by some position 31.6% of the time. So about a third of the time. All right, so now we want to figure out how often the cutoff open is called. How often does the button call and not get squeezed by the small blind or big blind? And we're going to assume the squeeze percentage is the same as the 3-bet percentage. And honestly, I think that sounds really reasonable. You might have the small blind start having some cold calling range with pocket pairs or something if the button calls 2. But for the most part, I think the squeeze ranges and the 3-bet ranges are going to be really close, at least close enough that we're not going to worry about it. All right, so we want to figure out how often does the button call and not get squeezed. Because remember, if the cutoff opens with the worst hand in his range and he faces a 3-bet or faces a squeeze, he's going to fold. So we want to see how often the cutoff can open and then get called without getting 3-bet, so he at least gets to see the flop. All right. So the button is going to call 10.4% of the time, so that's the 0.104. And then the small blind is not going to 3-bet 1 minus 0.148 because 0.148 is 14.8%, which is the small blind 3-bet. Then we multiply that again, lastly, by 1 minus 0.107 because 10.7% is the big blind 3-bet. So this is how often the button calls. This is how often the small blind does not 3-bet. This is often the big blind does not 3-bet. We multiply them together and we see that the cutoff will open and get called by the button without the blinds squeezing 7.9%. Now, how often does the big blind call after the button and small blind fold? Again, we don't want to double count calls or 3-bets, so we have to solve for that the same way. So right here, we subtracted the button 3-bet and the button fold. Sorry, we subtracted the button 3-bet and the button call from 1 to get us how often the button folds. Here we did the same thing for the small blind. It's just 1 minus 0.148 because the small blind 3-bets 14.8% of the time, so it's going to fold 1 minus 0.148. And then the big blind calls 23.8% of the time when it folds to the big blind, so that's where the 0.238 comes from. So button fold times small blind fold times big blind call equals 16.1%. So the button calls 7.9% and big blind calls 16.1% after all their positions fold. So that means in total, the cutoff's going to open and get called 24% of the time because the button's going to call 7.9% and the other positions will fold, and the big blind's going to call 16.1% after the other positions folded. Don't worry about this math if math's not very intuitive to you, but it's just important we calculate things this way because if we don't, we're going to end up doing a lot of double counting where we'll count like the button calls without taking into account the fact that, the big blind ended up 3-betting. So we had to calculate it this sort of long way, which is actually a pain to do, but I did it for you. So in total, the cutoff will open and get called 24% of the time. So now we want to figure out how much the cutoff effectively pays to see a flop with the worst hand in his opening range. All right, so trust me, it's easier this way, at least for me and for most of the people I explain it to, where we're going to assume we open 1,000 times because this is going to actually let us work with a lot of like whole numbers, whereas if we don't assume we open 1,000 times when we analyze this, we're going to just end up with tons of fractions and weird percentages, which just tend to confuse people. So anyways, we're going to assume we open 1,000 times to illustrate what I'm talking about here. So if we open 1,000 times, we're going to get 3-bet 316 times because we opened 1,000 times and then times 31.6%. So we got 3-bet 316 times total. We're going to get called 24% of the time we open. So 1,000 times 24% equals 240. And then we're going to get folds the rest. So 1,000 times 44.4% equals 444. And the way I found this 44.4% was I just took 100%, subtracted 31.6%, and then subtracted 24% because the amount of times we're going to get folds is going to be equal to, 100% minus the percentage of the time we're called and minus the percentage of the time we're 3-bet. But since this math is so tricky in the sense that it's pretty easy to make a mistake and double count something, I actually ended up double checking here. So I took the button fold frequency, 1 minus 0.104 minus 0.101, multiplied it by the small blind fold frequency, 1 minus 0.148, and multiplied it by the big blind fold frequency, 1 minus 0.107 minus 0.238. For some reason, had the urge to put down a ton of significant figures and got this weird number, which is 44.4%. So I double checked the math. All the math checks out. So we pretty much can't have made a mistake here unless I made 2 mistakes. So we're pretty much good to go. The opponent folds 44.4% of the time for 444 times total if we opened 1,000 times. All right, so always double check the math for stuff that's important since there's so much tricky stuff to remember. I've done it many times before. I've seen other people do it many times before, where you make a mistake when you're doing like pre-flop or flop calculations because you didn't double check or because you decided to take a shortcut, and then you end up making tons of wrong ranges and tons of incorrect assumptions, and it just ends up wasting a bunch of time and potentially costing you money for a while. Let's see how much money we win or lose pre-flop in 1,000 opens. Well, we're going to get 3-bet 316 times. Every time we get 3-bet and we're holding the worst hand in our range, we're going to fold. So 316 times negative 2.5, because we're losing 2.5 big blinds when we open in the cutoff and then fold to a 3-bet. So negative 2.5 times 316. If we open 1,000 times, we're going to lose 790 big blinds from the times we've folded pre-flop to the 3-bet. We're going to get 444 folds. So every time our opponents fold, we're going to win 1.5 big blinds because there's no ante here. So 1.5 times 444 equals 666. So that's how much money we win from pre-flop. So our total pre-flop net, so the amount of money we've won or lost without seeing a flop, is negative 124 big blinds. So yeah, just know the units here as big blinds. Step 3 continued. We're called 240 times and need to win back that 126 big blinds we lost pre-flop by getting 3-bets and folds. Don't let the negative signs confuse you here. I'm going to explain exactly what everything means in a second, and I was kind of on the fence for whether to include the negatives when doing the next step. But anyways, I took 126 and divided by 240, and that gave us 0.53. So what that means is, since we overall were losing 126 big blinds pre-flop, but we were called 240 times pre-flop, we need to win on average 0.53 big blinds per hand each time we're called. That's how much money we would need to win on average per hand when we're called in order to have broken even by opening the weakest hand in our cutoff opening range. So if on average we win 0.53 big blinds overall for the hand when called, we'll break even opening the worst hand in our cutoff opening range. So let this sink in. So the worst hand in our cutoff opening range should either be break even or only very, very, very slightly profitable overall. I don't remember having included this little tidbit of information, but what I'm saying here is we don't know in theory whether or not the worst hand in the cutoff opening range is supposed to be super, super, super slightly profitable or exactly break even. If the worst hand in the cutoff opening range is exactly break even, it might be a mixed strategy. So for example, if the worst hand we opened in the cutoff open was King 5 suited, maybe we should only open it part of the time if it breaks even. So I'm already regretting it, including this as I'm talking about it, but this is just a really, really detailed thing saying, whenever you hear someone talk about this, they'll basically say that the worst hand in your cutoff opening range should be break even, but in reality, it should either be break even or super, super, super slightly profitable. Don't worry about this if it's confusing. So yeah, don't worry about detailed stuff. Worry about stuff that's important for helping you make ranges for other positions or helping you understand post-flop play or helping you understand what's going on. For something really detailed like that, you don't need to worry if it's confusing. All right, so step 4, analysis. So our overall EV for the hand needs to be around 0.5 big blinds when called. I went to one significant figure here. We are called 7.8% of the time by the button without the other positions 3-betting, and the big blind calls 16.1% of the time. So the big blind calls about twice as often as the button does, which is awesome because we do way better in position against a crappy range than we do out of position against a stronger range. Okay, so we need our post-flop EV to be on average about 2.5 plus 0.5 equals 3 big blinds post-flop. Because remember, if we're trying to win half a big blind overall for the hand, well, if we risk 2.5, sometimes people don't like it if I use the word risk. If we open for 2.5 big blinds, and we need to win on average 0.5 big blinds overall for the hand, then our post-flop EV will have to be 2.5 plus 0.5 equals 3 big blinds. So there's two situations. Situation A, the button calls and the blinds fold, is our EV with the worst hand in our cutoff opening range, 3 big blinds or more against the cutoff range. Remember, the pot is 6.5 big blinds if we open the cutoff, button calls, and the blinds fold. So on average, do you think our EV is 3 big blinds post-flop in this situation? So that's less than half the pot. So let's look, probably not, but it's close. So if I wrote let's look, I'm guessing I wanted to actually show you the ranges. So here's our cutoff opening range. And let's say king 5 suited was a hand that we think should be about break even. Because if we're opening king 5 suited and folding king 4 suited, it pretty much means by definition we have to think king 5 suited is right around break even. Now, how does king 5 suited do against the button flatting range? Not that well, right? One thing that's nice about having opened in the cutoff is we have a lot of strong hands in our range, which means we might get a good bluff opportunity on the flop or post flop. So for example, if the flop comes like 2-2-6, our range is just so good after having opened the cutoff that we can probably profitably bluff against the button just because we got such a good flop for our range. So again, if this was the flop, this flop would be so good for this range that we could bluff with a king 5 suited and make the opponent fold a lot. But on most flop textures, king 5 suited is not going to be that great. We really need to either like flop a king or a flush draw to feel that good about it. So I don't think king 5 suited is going to, on average, have 3 big blinds worth of EV and a 6.5 big blind pot. Because, again, the king 5 suited was the worst hand in our cutoff opening range, and this button cold calling range is designed to do pretty well against our cutoff open, much less against the worst hand in our range. We're just dominated when we flop a king, we can get dominated pretty easily, and the button just has position in a lot of pretty good hands. So yeah, I would say no, we don't have 3 big blinds in EV post flop when we open the cutoff and the button calls, but I'm just guessing. So we're going to continue the analysis. Situation B, we open and the big blind calls. The pot is 5.5 big blinds, and we need to win on average 3 big blinds. The pot will, of course, be smaller here because the big blind got a discount on his call. So the pot is 5.5 big blinds when just the big blind calls, even though it's 6.5 big blinds when the button calls. So do we think we have that average? Do you think we on average have an EV of 3 big blinds post flop when the big blind calls? Again, it's probably close, but I think we got this despite the fact that the pot's smaller here. We have position, we have the stronger range in terms of equity, and we have a better distribution of equity. So we have all 3 of the things that I really look for in my range, which is, yeah, we've got position, yeah, we have more equity, and yeah, we have a better distribution of equity. So that's saying king 5 suited is probably going to be much more profitable in this situation than it often will be. Remember, our opponent calls with many hands, just trying to lose less than overall 1 big blind for the hand. So one thing that's really important to keep in mind is the expected value of a hand will change based on the range it's in. I'm going to say that one more time because it's so important. The expected value of a hand will change based on the range it's in. So look at this cutoff opening range. It's a pretty, beefcake range. It's strong. It's linear. If we wanted to get technical, it's just like the 27% best hands that we can be dealt in the cutoff. Now, the big blind range, the big blind cold calling range is what I would call a condensed range, meaning it only has like the medium strength stuff. But here it's even more extreme because the big blind was calling with hands that were just hoping to lose overall less than 1 big blind for the hand. So the cutoff range not only is in position, it's an overall much better range than the big blind range. So because of that, even when we have a weak hand in the cutoff, we're going to get better bluffing opportunities than we otherwise would because our opponent's going to have to fold so much to us knowing our range is better than his and we have position. So let's stick with that example that I talked about just a second ago. Let's assume we got a really good flop for the cutoff opening range and got a 6-2-2 flop. Here, the big blind is going to have to fold a ton to a c-bet because the big blind is out of position and his range just sucks here. So even if we had king 5 of spades, like imagine this, the big blind could have king 5 of spades or the cutoff opener could have king 5 of spades. But who's going to win the pot? Even if we have, oh, sorry, one sec. So I got flustered, but I'm not going to delete the last recording because I like the way I expressed myself before that. So let's just start over really quickly. Let's assume that we open in the cutoff with king 5 of hearts, which I have right here, and the big blind calls with king 5 of clubs. So we both have the exact same hand, and the flop comes king 2-2. So we both have the exact same hand, king 5 suited with the backdoor flush draw. So even though we both have the exact same hand, who's going to win the pot? Us with king 5 suited in the cutoff, or the big blind with king 5 suited? Well, we're of course going to win it. because we're going to see bet our entire range on this flop since our range is so much better than the opponent's and we have position. And when we see bet our entire range on this flop, our opponent's going to fold a ton because he has the weaker range and he's out of position. So really make sure this sinks in. Even though we have the exact same hand here, we are always going to see bet and we're always going to win the pot because our range is better and we have position. So the EV of a hand will change drastically based on the range it's in. In this example, we win the entire pot even when we have the exact same hand as the opponent. So it's really important to understand that because that's my justification for why I think our EV here will be 3 big blinds or greater, even though we have the weakest hand in our range and 3 big blinds is over half the size of the pot. So you're free to disagree with me, right? No one knows the answer to this, even players way better than me. They don't know the answer to this, but at least understand why I think the way I do. And if you agree with me, then you might be starting to think like, oh, even though these ranges Janda's advocating seem really aggro in a lot of ways, they might make sense. Okay, so my thoughts. Honestly, I think these ranges look super good so far. Now, we're of course not done analyzing them yet, but I just mean right now, nothing's really striking me as wrong. All the numbers seem about right if I would have had to have guessed for what the numbers should be, and everything seems to logically be making sense. So right now, I'm pretty happy with them. I have done this like 10 times with different ranges, as I mentioned earlier, so I'm pretty used to doing this. Like this was nowhere near a wild guess for what I thought would be correct given a 2.5 cutoff open. And these are very aggro 3-betting ranges, but this is likely much closer to game theoretically optimal than older and tighter ranges. So don't do this, but if you were to watch my videos from like my stocks poker days, which were I think 4 years ago, I'm probably using way, way worse ranges than we just made right now. They were probably way tighter and they're just not nearly as good. We'll check the equity of these ranges a bit later. Honestly, I don't know if I'm going to have time to do this in the video, even though I planned on it, but let's try to make sure everything else at least makes sense first before we start looking at equities of different ranges. Now, granted, we can't determine the expected value of a hand based just on its equity, and we can't determine which range is better based just on their equity, but it's still a useful thing to do, to have a sense of how much equity each range has, and that might tell us if something seems a little bit off. All right, so now we need to do the maths for defending against 3 bets. So we'll get reasonably but not crazy technical here. Right now, I'm using the same defending frequency versus all 3-betting ranges as I just talked about. And while I did play a little bit of poker last year, it's no secret that I haven't played much since Black Friday. So when I say these are the ranges that I'm using now, I'm saying these are the best ranges I have. If I were to be playing 6-max right now, these are the ranges that I would use. Pretty much readless if I thought I was playing against good opponents. And technically, all my 3-betting defending ranges would be different based on where the 3-bet came from, though I'm not sure exactly how. I'd more or less stick with the range I have, and then in reality, I'd adjust it a little bit based on how I think the games play, and if I had reads, if I was allowed to use a HUD on the side I was playing, obviously my HUD would be pretty important for determining what hands I 3-bet and what hands I 4-bet and what hands I call and what hands I fold, especially the stuff that I think is close. Okay, so let's start with examining defending versus a 3-bet, then extrapolating from there. So again, through the magic of editing, I just looked at this sentence. Let's start with examining defending versus a 3-bet, then extrapolating from there. We're going to look at a big blind 3-bet and then extrapolate from there. So we're going to start with looking at a big blind 3-bet, and then we're going to try to make some educated guesses about how to defend against a small blind in button 3-bet as well. Okay, so facing the big blind 3-bet. We are currently opening 26.7% of the time in the cutoff and calling versus 3-bet 11.9% and 4-betting 4.4%. So we are calling 11.9% divided by 26.7% equals 44.6%. So we call a little bit less than half the time when we face a 3-bet. And we are 4-betting 16.5%. So we're 4-betting, what is that, about a sixth of the time when we face a 3-bet. In total, we're defending 61.1% of the time and folding 38.9% of the time. So this probably seems like crazy aggressive defending. If you look at the ranges people used a couple years ago, that's not that crazy anymore. This is probably closer to what's theoretically correct because remember, we're calling with a lot of hands expecting to lose less money by calling than we would have by folding. And we're getting around 2-to-1 odds when we call a 3-bet and we're in position. So we're calling a lot even though we're not happy about it. Whereas back in the day, people would be like, oh, just fold, it's lower variance, and people also 3-bet much less aggressively several years ago. All right, so let's calculate how much money the 3-better on average pays to see a flop. So we're going to be doing the exact same type of math that we just did for a cutoff open. Now we're saying how much money does the big blind on average have to pay to see a flop when the big blind 3-bet bluffs. If the big blind 3-bets 1,000 times, he'll get 4-bet 1,000 times 16.5% equals 165. So he'll thus lose 165 times negative 8.25 to lose 1,361 big blinds pre-flop from 4-bets. Remember, the 3-bet size was 9.25 big blinds when out of position, so that means the big blind effectively risked 9.25 minus 1 for 8.25 big blinds total. So in other words, when the big blind 3-bets and folds to a 4-bet, he lost 8.25 big blinds more than he would have if he had just folded pre-flop without 3-betting. Big blind gets folds 1,000 times 38.9% of the time for 389 times total. And then every time the big blind gets folds, he wins 4 big blinds. So 389 times 4 equals 1,556 big blinds total. And the big blind thus nets 1,556 minus 1,361. So the big blind nets 195 big blinds total pre-flop without seeing a flop. But to be indifferent to folding, the big blind will on average have to lose 0.437 plus 1 equals 14.37 big blinds overall for the hand when called. That's because if the big blind just folds pre-flop, he still overall loses 1 big blind for the hand. So I messed up the first time I did this, and I had to go correct the slides, and I'm going to have to tweak math after this for the next video. When the big blind folds pre-flop, he overall, of course, loses 1 big blind for the hand. So you have to take that into account when trying to make the big blind indifferent to 3-betting or folding pre-flop. I know this sounds really easy right now as you're looking at the video, but it's really easy to make a quick mistake when you're actually doing the math. So if we do want to make the big blind indifferent to folding or 3-bet, we have to remember that the big blind can still overall lose money for the hand with his worst 3-bet bluff as long as he loses less money overall than 1 big blind, because if the big blind were to fold pre-flop, he loses 1 big blind. So that's why we have to add this one right here. So I'm going to say it one more time. To be indifferent to folding or 3-betting pre-flop, the big blind will on average have to lose 1.437 big blinds when called. Okay. So it's been about an hour, so we're going to have to wrap it up. As I mentioned, I actually did make that last little mistake. So I'm going to have to fix the following slides for the next video. But the next video should take about maybe not a full hour, but pretty close to another hour just to finish talking about pre-flop play. Note, I appreciate your optical patronage. I hope you'll watch the rest of the series as well. We will finish talking about pre-flop next video. And thank you for watching again, and feel free to post comments and questions in the forums. I'll try to help if I can. We did cover a really lot of stuff in this video, so if you do have questions about any sort of pre-flop ranges, even if it's not just cutoff stuff, just let me know and I'll try to help you out. So thanks again. Take care, everyone. I'll see you soon.